Good morning, everyone. When we think about the history of the United States of America, we are not just looking at dates and battles, we are really tracing the heartbeat of a nation that grew from dreams, struggles, and determination. It all began with small groups of settlers arriving on the shores, carrying hopes of a new life, searching for freedom, and willing to endure hardships to build something greater than themselves. From those early colonies grew the spirit of independence, a voice that declared the right to be free, to govern, and to chart a new destiny. The journey was never smooth. The nation passed through times of conflict, when unity was tested and people stood divided. Yet through those struggles came strength, and the idea that freedom and equality must belong to every individual slowly started to take root. The fight for rights, whether for women, for African Americans, for workers, or for immigrants arriving with nothing but dreams, became chapters that shaped the soul of the country. Every step forward was built by courage, by voices that refused to be silenced, and by ordinary people who wanted a fairer future. As the years moved on, the United States grew into a land of innovation and creativity. It became a place where new ideas in science, technology, and culture began to inspire the world. Cities rose, railroads stretched across the land, and the sense of possibility seemed endless. Even in times of Great Depression and war, the resilience of the people carried the nation forward, showing that hope can rise again even from the darkest hours. The story of the USA is also the story of diversity. People from every corner of the world found a home there, bringing languages, traditions, foods, and beliefs that blended into a rich and colorful identity. That mix of cultures gave the country its unique strength, reminding everyone that unity does not mean sameness, but rather the beauty of differences coming together. Today, when we look back at the history of the United States, we see a nation that was never perfect, but always striving, always dreaming, and always reaching toward a brighter horizon. It is a history of courage and creativity, of voices rising in protest, of hands building and rebuilding, and of hearts believing in the promise of freedom. The story of early settlers seeking freedom and the birth of independence is a story filled with courage, risk, and vision, where ordinary people carried extraordinary hopes across oceans into a land unknown to them. When ships first arrived on the shores of North America, the men, women, and children stepping off were leaving behind familiar worlds of towns, fields, and traditions to enter a wilderness they had never seen before. They were not adventurers seeking riches, but families searching for a place where they could live in freedom, practice their beliefs without fear, and build a life that reflected their dreams. The harsh winters, limited supplies, and the challenge of surviving in a strange environment tested them in ways that are difficult for us to imagine today. Hunger, illness, and isolation took many lives, but those who endured planted the first seeds of what would grow into a new nation. These settlers carried with them ideas that were simple but powerful. The belief that life should be lived with dignity, that no one should be forced into silence. Their beliefs and that community could be shaped by choice rather than imposed by power. Villages and towns grew slowly, with wooden houses, small meeting halls, and farms stretching into the distance, each settlement reflecting both struggle and hope. Over time, as generations passed, the settlers' children and grandchildren began to see themselves not only as immigrants from distant lands, but as something different, as people connected to the soil and spirit of this new world. They worked hard, learning from the land and from those who already lived there, blending traditions while shaping a new culture that was not quite European anymore, but not yet fully American. As the colonies expanded, so too did the desire for independence, for self-rule, for a chance to decide their own destiny without the constant hand of distant rulers. Taxation, restrictions on trade, and laws that seemed unfair stirred frustration. More than that, it was the feeling that their voices were unheard, that they were being treated as subjects rather than equals, that gave rise to a new identity. The conversations in taverns, town squares, and meeting houses were not only about daily struggles, but about principles of justice, freedom, and the right to shape their own communities. These ideas were not born overnight. They grew slowly, nurtured by generations who valued freedom and carried deep memories of oppression from their homelands. This sense of identity grew stronger with every restriction imposed upon them, until the call for independence became too powerful to ignore. What is fascinating is that the settlers, who had once come seeking safety and survival, had by then developed a courage that stretched beyond survival. In the realm of vision, they wanted not just to live, but to live free, to pass on to their children a land where the rules would reflect the will of the people. They imagined a society where decisions would be made by assemblies, where justice would belong to everyone, and where freedom was more than a word. It was a promise to be guarded. The courage to take such a stand against one of the greatest powers of the time was born out of a century of hardship, learning, and resilience, each trial preparing them for the moment when they would finally declare their independence. Independence did not come without sacrifices. It was a long journey of organizing, planning, and uniting people across distant colonies who had different ways of life but shared a common dream. Farmers, merchants, and scholars came together, realizing that only through unity could they achieve the freedom they longed for. The decision to break away was not taken lightly. It meant uncertainty, it meant conflict, and it meant facing the unknown once again, just as their ancestors had faced the unknown seas when they first set sail. But this time the unknown was not about geography, it was about destiny, about carving out a nation built on principles rather than power. The birth of independence became more than just a political act, it became a defining spirit. It transformed the settlers from scattered communities into a people who believed they had the right to determine their own future. It was not just about resisting control, but about creating something entirely new, something the world had not seen before. A nation founded not on inheritance or monarchy, but on ideals of liberty and self-rule. The dreams that once pushed settlers across oceans were now reshaped into the dreams of a nation, dreams that would echo for generations. Every hardship they had endured, every loss they had faced, and every ounce of courage they had shown became part of the foundation on which independence was declared, marking the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold across centuries. The struggles and conflicts that shaped the nation's unity began long before the United States ever thought of itself as united, because in the earliest years the colonies were scattered, different in culture, economy, and belief, each one facing its own battles for survival. Yet beneath those differences there was always a slow pull towards something shared, a sense that challenges could be faced more strongly together than apart. The hardships of frontier life, the danger of attacks, the shortages of food, and the heavy hand of distant rulers created a bond of common struggle. People who may never have spoken to one another suddenly found themselves part of a larger story, where the outcome of one region's fight for fairness could shape the destiny of all. Conflict was woven into this story, for no young nation is born without pain. There were disputes over laws and taxation that made ordinary families feel powerless in their own homes. There were arguments over who held authority, whether distant rulers across the ocean had the right to control every detail of life in a land they did not live in. There were protests and boycotts, gatherings where people raised their voices not only for themselves, but for the generations they knew would follow. With each act of resistance, unity began to form, because shared frustration has a way of binding people together. Strangers became allies, and separate colonies began to recognize that their battles were not isolated, but part of one greater cause. When talk of independence grew louder, unity was tested even more deeply. Not everyone agreed, and divisions appeared between those who wanted change and those who feared it. Families split, neighbors argued, and entire towns were divided. But conflict also clarified what truly mattered, pushing people to decide whether they would cling to old systems or fight for new ones. Through fiery debates, bold pamphlets, and countless meetings in small halls, people found their voices and though they did not always agree, the very act of speaking together created a sense of shared responsibility. Out of division grew a fragile but determined unity, the kind that comes not from easy agreement but from the courage to move forward despite differences. As independence was declared and the struggle for freedom turned into open conflict, unity was tested on the battlefield as well as in the heart. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and laborers left their homes and joined forces, not because they were soldiers by trade, but because they believed in something larger than themselves. Each sacrifice, each hardship endured in war, became another thread in the fabric of unity, binding together people from distant colonies who might otherwise have remained strangers. The shared pain of loss and the shared hope of victory created bonds that went deeper than words. Out of the smoke and fire of conflict emerged not only the promise of independence, but also the recognition that the nation could only survive if it remained together even after independence was achieved. The struggles did not end. Questions of how to govern, how to balance freedom with order, and how to unite regions with such different needs created conflicts that once again threatened to tear apart what had been built. Debates over power, representation, and rights shook the foundations of the young nation. These conflicts were not signs of failure, but signs of growth, proof that unity is not a gift handed down, but something earned through effort and compromise. From passionate debates in crowded rooms to compromises hammered out by tired leaders, the idea of unity grew stronger, not as something easy, but as something worth fighting, for the most painful struggle of all came in the form of division so deep it erupted into civil war, a conflict that revealed both the darkest and the brightest parts of the national spirit. It was a time when unity nearly broke beyond repair, when brother fought against brother, and the very survival of the nation seemed uncertain. Yet out of this terrible conflict, the meaning of unity was reborn, shaped not only by victory but by sacrifice. It was a harsh reminder that unity cannot be taken for granted, that it must be renewed through every generation, and that struggles, as devastating as they are, can force a nation to face its deepest flaws and move towards something better as time went on. Other struggles rose to the surface, each testing unity in new ways. Movements for rights, protests against injustice, voices demanding recognition all became part of the continuing story. At every stage, unity was stretched, questioned, and sometimes nearly broken, but again and again it was rebuilt. The conflicts of the past, whether fought with weapons or with words, left behind lessons in resilience. They showed that unity is not the absence of struggle, but the strength to endure it together. Each conflict became a teacher, shaping a people who learned that the only way to move forward was not in isolation but in shared purpose. Not in silence, but in a chorus of voices rising from every corner of the nation. Growth through innovation, creativity, and resilience has always been one of the defining characteristics of the United States, shaping not only its own story, but influencing the course of history far beyond its borders. From the earliest days of settlement, when survival depended on adapting to new environments, building homes from rough timber, and learning how to cultivate unfamiliar land, innovation was not a luxury, but a necessity. People created tools from what they had, found ways to preserve food through harsh winters, and developed systems of cooperation that allowed small communities to flourish. This spirit of creativity was not confined to survival alone. It sparked ideas for trade, communication, and new ways of living, laying the foundation for a society that would always look toward possibility as towns grew into cities and cities into thriving centers of activity. The energy of innovation only expanded. The building of railroads that stretched from one end of the continent to the other became not just a feat of engineering, but a symbol of resilience, connecting people, goods, and ideas across vast distances. The telegraph followed, shrinking the world by allowing messages to travel at lightning speed compared to the past. These changes transformed daily life and gave rise to a sense that no challenge was too great to overcome if imagination and determination were applied. Each generation added something new, from factories powered by steam to machines that produced goods faster and cheaper than ever before, fueling both economic growth and a growing sense of national pride. Resilience was equally important in times of hardship, for innovation does not happen in moments of comfort alone. During periods of economic depression, when unemployment was high and despair seemed heavy, people found ways to rebuild, to create jobs, to dream again. Farmers struggling with difficult land experimented with new techniques, industries adapted to shifting markets, and communities supported one another through collective effort. In times of war, creativity turned toward invention, producing tools, vehicles, and medicines that not only carried the nation through crisis, but often transformed civilian life afterward. Each trial tested the strength of the people, yet again and again they responded with resilience, proving that adversity could be a spark for progress. The birth of new industries showed the world how creativity could reshape life itself. The invention of the airplane turned the dream of flight into a reality, shrinking distances between people and opening the skies to commerce and travel. The rise of the automobile industry changed how people lived, worked, and connected, creating a culture of mobility and independence that became central to the American way of life. Factories produced not only goods but opportunities, drawing people from across the world to share in the promise of work and possibility. This constant cycle of inventing, building, and adapting created a culture that celebrated progress and looked forward to the future with energy and optimism. In culture as well as in industry, creativity gave birth to movements that shaped global imagination. Music, literature, and art flourished, reflecting both the struggles and the joys of the people. Jazz, born from communities that carried deep histories of resilience, became a sound that traveled across oceans. Writers captured the voices of workers, immigrants, dreamers, and rebels, telling stories that gave identity to those often overlooked. Film became a powerful medium, turning storytelling into a shared experience that reached millions. Each artistic creation was itself an act of resilience, a way of transforming hardship into beauty, giving people not only entertainment but also hope and reflection. Innovation also found its home in science and technology. The exploration of space, with rockets piercing the sky and astronauts walking where no human had walked before, became one of the most dramatic examples of how creativity and resilience could expand the boundaries of what seemed possible. The computer revolution, beginning with massive machines and evolving into devices that fit in the palm of a hand, reshaped communication, learning, and commerce. Medical discoveries cured illnesses that once claimed countless lives, extending not only years but the quality of life itself. Each achievement was the result of persistence, of long nights of work, of failures that led to breakthroughs, showing that resilience is the partner of every great innovation. Through these patterns of growth, it becomes clear that creativity has never been separate from resilience. They work together, feeding one another. When challenges arise, resilience keeps the spirit alive, while creativity offers solutions and visions of something better. When opportunities appear, innovation builds upon them, and resilience ensures that progress is not fleeting but lasting. The cycle repeats across centuries, weaving a story of a nation that has never stood still, that has always sought to invent, to improve, and to push the boundaries of what life could be. This constant growth became not just a characteristic of the United States, but a message to the world that even in the face of obstacles, imagination combined with determination can create paths where none existed before. Diversity of people and cultures, building a unique identity, has been one of the most defining features of the United States, shaping not only its history, but also the way it continues to grow and evolve. From the earliest days when settlers arrived from across the ocean, bringing with them languages, customs, and beliefs, the land began to transform into a meeting place of differences. Native peoples already carried rich traditions, stories, and ways of living that had shaped the continent for centuries before newcomers set foot on its shores. The arrival of Europeans, followed by waves of immigrants from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, created a complex mixture of cultures, sometimes blending peacefully, sometimes clashing painfully, but always weaving together into something that could never have existed anywhere else. Each group brought with it not only labor and survival skills, but also music, foods, festivals, and faiths that would leave permanent marks on the national identity in the early years. Communities often held tightly to their heritage, building small enclaves where their languages and customs remained alive, where bakeries, schools, and churches reminded them of the lands they had left behind. Irish neighborhoods, Italian quarters, German farming towns, Chinese communities in bustling cities, and African American cultural centers all became threads in the fabric of a growing nation. Over time, while each group maintained parts of its identity, they also shared and exchanged elements with others, creating new traditions that belonged uniquely to the United States. This constant mixing, whether through food on the table, songs sung at gatherings, or celebrations held in city streets, gave rise to a culture that could not be defined by one heritage alone, but by many interwoven together. The richness of diversity was not always celebrated. At times it was met with suspicion, resistance, and even violence. Immigrants often faced discrimination, exclusion, and laws that tried to limit their opportunities. Different languages and customs were sometimes mocked rather than appreciated, and many families carried the weight of being seen as outsiders. Yet, even in the face of rejection, resilience carried these communities forward, and their contributions became impossible to ignore. Railroads built with the labor of Chinese immigrants, farms cultivated by German and Scandinavian settlers, industries powered by the hands of Eastern European workers, and cities enriched by the creativity of African American artists all proved that diversity was not a weakness but a source of incredible strength. Every wave of migration, whether welcomed or resisted, expanded the definition of what it meant to belong to the United States as the nation grew. Diversity became a driving force in shaping its art, literature, and music. From the spirituals sung in fields that evolved into gospel and later into jazz and blues, to the rhythms carried from Latin America that inspired dances across the country, to the stories told by immigrant writers capturing the hopes and struggles of new lives, culture became a mirror of diversity. Hollywood films reflected not only fantasies, but also the voices of countless backgrounds, while Broadway stages showcased the blending of old-world traditions with new-world creativity. The diversity of voices ensured that American culture was never static, always shifting, always finding new forms of expression that reached far beyond its borders. Food became another language of diversity, telling stories of migration and adaptation. Italian pasta mixed with American ingredients. Chinese dishes evolved into creations that could be found in small towns and large cities alike. African flavors blended with Southern traditions, and Mexican recipes brought vibrant spices to the table. Each plate carried history, memory, and identity, reminding people that culture could be shared, enjoyed, and passed down not only through words but through tastes and gatherings. These meals became part of family traditions across the country, showing how diversity worked its way into the everyday life of the nation. Religion, too, reflected the nation's diversity, with churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues rising in cities and towns, each serving as a center of faith and community. This coexistence of many beliefs in one land was not always without tension, but it allowed for a landscape where people could practice freely, where traditions could be preserved, and where tolerance slowly grew as neighbors learned from one another. The presence of so many faiths created a mosaic of rituals and celebrations, from Christmas parades to Ramadan dinners, from Passover gatherings to Diwali festivals, each adding color and meaning to the larger national identity. The strength of diversity also revealed itself in the nation. Resilience during times of crisis, when wars, disasters, or economic struggles struck. It was people from all backgrounds who came together to rebuild, to serve, and to sacrifice. Immigrant soldiers fought side by side, women of different heritages worked in factories during wartime, and communities of every culture opened their doors to neighbors in need. This shared effort showed that despite differences in origin, there was a deeper unity that came from living, working, and dreaming together. Out of these moments, a stronger sense of belonging emerged, reminding everyone that the nation's identity was not tied to one people alone, but to the contributions of many over centuries. The constant flow of new people continued to reshape the cultural identity of the United States. Each new arrival brought something valuable, whether it was a song, a recipe, a craft, a skill, or simply a new way of looking at the world. The nation became not a melting pot where all differences disappeared, but a mosaic where each piece retained its color and shape while contributing to a larger, more vibrant picture. This mosaic identity made the United States a place admired for its creativity, its adaptability, and its ability to draw strength from difference rather than uniformity. Diversity became both a challenge and a gift, a never-ending process of negotiation, blending, and celebration that continues to define the unique spirit of the nation. A continuous journey of striving for freedom and equality has always been at the heart of the history of the United States, shaping every era and leaving behind stories of courage, resistance, and hope. From the earliest voices calling for independence to the movements that demanded justice for those left out of that promise, the nation has been defined by the struggle to live up to ideals that were declared but not always realized. The Declaration of Independence spoke of liberty, but women, enslaved people, and indigenous communities were not included in that vision, and so the journey began with contradictions that generations would challenge. Every step forward was marked by people who believed that freedom and equality were not privileges for a few but rights for all. People who refused to accept silence and worked to transform ideals into reality. The fight against slavery became one of the earliest and most powerful struggles. Freedom, a battle that stretched across decades and revealed the depth of the nation's divisions. Abolitionists spoke with fiery voices, printing pamphlets, organizing meetings, and risking their safety to demand an end to human bondage. Escaped men and women told their stories, turning personal suffering into powerful testimony that shook the conscience of many. The Underground Railroad became not only a path to freedom, but a symbol of solidarity, a reminder that freedom was not just an individual desire, but a shared responsibility. The Civil War, as devastating as it was, forced the nation to confront the contradiction between its ideals and its realities, and though the end of slavery was a monumental step, the path to true equality was far from complete. In the years that followed, African Americans faced segregation, discrimination, and violence, yet they never ceased striving for equality. Schools, churches, and organizations became centers of strength, places where communities nurtured resilience and taught the next generation to keep moving forward. The civil rights movement of the 20th century brought those struggles into the public eye with marches, sit-ins, and boycotts that revealed the power of nonviolent resistance. Leaders spoke from pulpits and street corners, demanding the fulfillment of promises made long before, while ordinary men, women, and children stood bravely in the face of injustice. Laws were changed, barriers were broken, and though challenges remained, each victory became part of the larger journey toward equality. Women too carried their own struggles for recognition and freedom, beginning with voices that demanded the right to vote and continuing with movements that sought equality in education, work, and political life. The suffrage movement stretched across decades, filled with parades, protests, and acts of determination that often went unnoticed or unappreciated until their victories became undeniable. Gaining the right to vote was a turning point, But it was only the beginning, as women continued to push against limits placed on their ambitions and choices. From boardrooms to classrooms, from scientific laboratories to political offices, women proved that equality was not only a right but a necessity for progress. Adding their energy and creativity to every part of national life, immigrants added another dimension to the journey, arriving from across oceans and borders, each carrying dreams of freedom that sometimes met with resistance and exclusion. Laws tried to keep them out, prejudice tried to silence them, but they carved out places of belonging and reminded the nation that freedom was not meant to be closed behind walls. Their struggles for fair wages, safe working conditions, and the chance to participate fully in society became part of the larger fight for equality, showing that the nation's promise was strongest when it opened its arms rather than closed them. Generations of immigrants faced hardship but also transformed the cultural and economic landscape, proving that striving for equality meant welcoming new voices and perspectives. Other groups too carried the torch of freedom in their own ways. Indigenous peoples fought to preserve their lands, traditions, and rights in the face of displacement and broken promises. Their survival, resilience, and ongoing demands for recognition form an essential part of the nation's story, reminding everyone that freedom cannot exist while justice is denied. Workers organized for rights in factories and fields, demanding fair hours and pay, transforming the workplace into a space where equality could be pursued. Movements for LGBTQ+ rights rose in the 20th century, breaking silence and insisting on dignity and acceptance. Each struggle, though different in form, was connected by the shared belief that equality must extend to all. The journey for freedom and equality has also unfolded in times of crisis, when wars, depressions, and disasters tested the meaning of liberty. During world wars, voices called out against injustice, even as the nation fought for freedom abroad, pointing to the hypocrisy of denying rights at home. During economic depressions, the poorest and most vulnerable demanded not only survival but dignity, forcing the country to rethink how freedom is tied to security and opportunity. In every generation, challenges gave rise to movements, and movements pushed the nation forward, proving that freedom is not a finished state but a living, growing pursuit. This continuous journey has always been driven by the voices of ordinary people as much as by leaders. For freedom and equality are never given freely but claimed through persistence. Marchers walking miles in the hot sun, students sitting quietly at segregated lunch counters, workers striking despite the threat of losing everything, mothers teaching their children to believe in themselves despite a world that told them otherwise. All these acts became the heartbeat of nation's story, each step built upon the sacrifices of those before, creating a chain of struggle and progress that stretched across centuries. The dream of freedom and equality has always been larger than any single group, larger than any single moment. A dream that continues to call for effort, courage, and faith that a nation can live up to its highest ideals.